Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to AJC at the Conventions 2020, AJC's virtual advocacy programming on the sidelines of the Democratic and Republican National Conventions. We are delighted to be joined today by KT McFarland, the U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor in 2017 and author of Revolution, Trump, Washington, and We the People, and Dr. Peter Berkowitz, Director of Policy Planning at the U.S. State Department and Senior Policy Advisor to the Secretary of State. Our esteemed guests, in a conversation with Julie Raymond, AJC Deputy Director of Policy and Diplomatic Affairs, will explore how America's approach to international affairs has changed in recent years, the forces that shape U.S. foreign policy, and what we can expect from the next 4 years. Please be advised that AJC is a nonpartisan 501c3 nonprofit organization. As such, AJC does not endorse or oppose political parties or candidates. And as a reminder, AJC has hosted identical panels on the sidelines of both the Democratic and Republican national conventions. After we hear from our panel, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Julie, you and our guests have the floor.
Thank you so much, Jillian. I'm so pleased to be here today with you, KT and Peter. KT, our audience loved the debate that you did with Tony Blinken during our global forum in June so much. We had to have you back. Peter, this is your warning. We request repeat performances.
Okay.
As I did last week during our program on the same topic alongside the DNC, I want to start off by stating that U.S. global leadership is an issue that's really at the core of AJC's worldview. We believe that we must work to ensure the strong leadership of the United States in global affairs as the best protection for our nation's interests, the preservation and promulgation of democratic values and human dignity, and the security of our closest allies. Last week, the first question I posed was about foreign aid, so it feels appropriate to start there again. Peter, I'll phrase this question for you. The international affairs budget is just 1% of our federal budget. It's a budget that in fact funds your role and your work. In recent years, there have been repeated threats and proposals from the administration to cut the resources for the State Department and for USAID. Can you speak to that? Do you take it personally? And what is the real impact? How would such significant cuts affect our ability to advance our interests abroad?
I think the aim here is to ensure that our influence abroad remains strong, directed, and targeted. To the extent there's a concern about cuts, there's a worry. It reflects a worry that American foreign aid is not being effectively directed. What we want is well-targeted aid. What we want is accountable aid. So therefore, I know this administration has been focusing on developing plans for more effective foreign aid, especially to the Indo-Pacific region, where the China challenge is at its most intense. And we're trying to work with partners around the world to combine public monies with government efforts to more effectively channel foreign investment into key regions to help us compete better with China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned China. We're gonna get there and spend a good deal of time talking about the China challenge. Sort of following the money for now, KT, I want to ask you. The Trump administration has sent budget requests to Congress removing all voluntary funding of the UN entities. And on multinational, multilateral institutions, the administration has pulled out of the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, threatened to withdraw from NATO, withdrew from the World Health Organization, and more. We know that there is a lot of concern about multinational organizations, and even some of the most fervent supporters will argue for reform. But KT, because you are a Deputy National Security Advisor, I want to ask you specifically from a national security perspective, does this disengagement place additional or undue pressure on our security establishment? And how do we sort of fill that void?
I think, Joy, the way to think about this is not in sort of a narrow sense, but think of it in a bigger sense. When President Trump came in, and by the way, I should point out, I'm no longer part of the administration. I don't speak for the administration. However, I was, as President Trump has very sweetly said, I was there to create the foreign policy from the very beginning. So I'm very aware of his thinking and the thinking that goes into American foreign policy now and what would happen in a second term. So that being said, President Trump, he's a businessman. He's not a typical politician. And just because people have done this the same way before, if it's not been effective, then change it. And so if you look at whether it's the United Nations or whether the World Health Organization or any of our international agreements, it's not that you don't want to have them. It's just you want to have them more effectively. So let's take NATO, for example. The United States, after World War II, we underwrote the security of all of our allies in Europe, as well as in the Pacific. We shouldered most of the defense, like 75% of the defense contribution, because our allies in the region couldn't afford it. And we never intended it to be permanent. We just intended it to help so we could have a mutual security agreements. But once they got on their feet, they were supposed to start contributing their own, and they haven't done it. And so even though presidents, Republicans, Democrats for decades have said to the Europeans and to the Asians, to Japan and Korea, look, it's time for you guys to, contribute more to common defense, there was always an excuse. And they never did it. So when President Trump said, you guys do it or else, and then he would talk about maybe we'll withdraw from NATO or whatever, those were negotiating tools. That's leverage. He's a businessman. At the end of the day, NATO has increased their defense spending by $500 billion. Now, no other president's been able to get that. So is that American leadership? Yeah, I think it is. Is it the threat to maybe we'll renegotiate, we'll recalibrate, maybe we won't withdraw? Sure, but that's a means to an end. And I can go around the world and give you examples like that. It doesn't mean we're withdrawing. It's just we want them to be effective. And if I look at the World Health Organization, those guys have a lot of explaining to do because of the poor handling of the coronavirus, because the World Health Organization, suppressed information. The United States and the globe is in lockdown. We're struggling with a pandemic that we did not need to have. And I put a lot of that fault at the World Health Organization. So do you want to keep contributing to something that's failing? No, you want them to reform. So I'm all for the fact that if the United States is going to spend our hard-earned tax dollars abroad, whether it's in foreign assistance or international organizations, they better be good. And we better be getting something for it. That's only fair to the American taxpayer.
Thank you. You said you could go around the world, so let's do that. Peter, I want to start with you, and I want to talk first about Iran. I think you know that AJC opposed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, yet we voiced concern with the decision to pull out of the deal because it fears that it could drive a wedge between the US and Europe on an issue on which we broadly agree. We were, as I'm sure you were, deeply disappointed to see the resolution calling for the extension of the arms embargo on Iran fail miserably in the UN Security Council, in part because the Europeans abstained. The Europeans are now saying that because the US is no longer a party to the JCPOA, we can't technically initiate snapback. US unilateral efforts related to Iran have proven successful. But how long can we go it alone? Can we get the results that we need without these international partners? What's the next step?
Well, before we take the next step, I think we have to understand the previous steps accurately. And I would not, I don't think it's quite right to speak about the US unilateral action in regard to Iran. I would have much preferred to see the Europeans step up and coordinate with us. But we need to understand that the American partners who are most directly affected by Iran's ceaseless effort to extend its hegemony throughout the Middle East, that is our Arab Gulf partners and Israel, are at one with us in our approach to Iran and support the maximum pressure campaign. That is, the countries that understand, I think, best and face most immediately the Iran threat are not opposing the United States. They don't understand this as unilateral. They understand this as the United States working actually with them to advance our shared interest in stability in the Middle East. So Is more diplomacy necessary to persuade the Europeans to do the right thing? Yes, of course. But again, I want to emphasize, it would be wrong to understand the United States as going alone because it's got a difference of opinion, important difference of opinion with our European friends. The United States is working closely with our partners in the Middle East, and I know Katie will have a lot to say about this. I believe one of the fruits of our partnership with our Arab Gulf friends and Israel is the upcoming formal normalization of relations between Israel and the UAE.
Absolutely. I want to talk about that. It was a deal that AJC heralded and celebrated. And KT, I will turn to you. You tweeted after this accord was reached, saying that it's a historic game changer for the entire Middle East. Other Sunni nations will follow, leaving Iran more isolated and economically devastated. Would you say that the threat posed by Iran is the driver of this breakthrough? Is fear of Iran what motivated or facilitated the agreement? Or is the increasingly isolated nature of the Iranian regime sort of an added benefit to what is already simply an amazing and historic breakthrough?
Which came first, the chicken or the egg? I think that, yeah, I mean, it's the same question. It really, who knows which came first? The fact that the United States and the Obama administration turned away from our traditional Sunni Arab allies in the region and favored Iran got the Sunni Arabs in the region a little nervous. It also got the Israelis very nervous because Iran was the main state sponsor of terror throughout the region. I mean, any real problem in the Middle East always had Iranian fingerprints on it. So that actually encouraged these two groups to get together. But, you know, I said at the time on the air that the thing about, you know, Donald Trump, we all know that he takes a lot of credit for things. In this case, I never thought I would say this, but Donald Trump didn't take enough credit for this achievement because this is historic beyond all belief. I mean, it goes back not just 40 years, he said. Look, it goes back thousands of years. This is the first peace treaty agreement between the Jews and the Arabs in all history. I mean, this is so significant because it's done a couple of things, and it needed to have a few steps prior to doing this. I mean, number one, moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was a major step because it gave Netanyahu and it gave the Israelis, it gave them the breathing space and it gave them the confidence that the United States would be with them. Number two, and I write about this in my book at great length, Jared Kushner came into the administration and President Trump said, you deal with the Middle East. And Kushner took a very different approach. You know, historically, it's always been this, Peter, excuse me, but it's always been the diplomats who've negotiated with the diplomats of other countries. Kushner understand, go to the guys with the money. Because if you can't make peace with the diplomats, they don't have the political bandwidth to do it. Go to the guys with the money, go to the money guys, cut the deal there first. And so he took a very different approach. By going to the Emirates, by going to the United Arab Emirates, who are really the bankers of the Middle East, he was able to cut a deal with them. They look at their own economic future. They look at, because of American fracking, among other things, that they're not going to be able to survive, not just the Emirates, but the entire Arab Middle East is not going to be able to survive on oil exports. That game is finished. They've got to find a new way to survive economically and modernize. So Jared made friends with that next generation of Arab leaders, the ones whose, you know, grandfathers and fathers had run the country for decades before, and the younger generation wanted to modernize economically and socially. And so that's where he made the inroads. And then by going to those groups and saying, you know, look, there are opportunities here. I mean, for example, Israel can't export to the Arab countries and vice versa. They can't trade with each other. But by the Emirates, the United Arab Emirates being first, that gives the Israelis and the Arabs a window to trade with each other. So I think that this is the first step. It's been done between the Israelis and the Arab bankers, the Sunni Arab bankers. It'll be followed by Bahrain. Several other countries will want to get in on it. I think you're going to see a California gold rush of economic opportunity in the Middle East. And because of the chicken and egg thing, what does it do to Iran? Iran was already in economic dire straits. because with the price of oil where it is and with the sanctions on Iran, they're being crushed economically. The pandemic has made an even greater effect on them. But the real key was the fact that President Trump had the guts to make the tough call to go after the king of terror, Qasem Soleimani, and taking him out and taking out the top leaders in the Iranian, really the, what do you want to call it? Maybe the Iranian foreign military service, their proxy armies that were going and creating havoc throughout the region. By neutralizing them, it put Iran in a different position, and it put the Sunni Arabs in a much stronger position. So all those steps had to happen first before you could do the deal. I predict in a second term, not only does the United States not need to be in the middle of those civil wars in the Middle East, but you will start seeing country after country in the region realizing that going to war with each other, Arabs, Israelis, Jews, Muslims, is not the way to provide peace and prosperity for themselves or their people. It's going to be to trade with each other. So you might see trade wars, but I don't think you're going to see hot wars.
So interesting. Peter, yes, please jump in. Tell us what this means broadly for the region, what it could mean for American engagement, what it might mean for existing treaties that Israel has with Egypt and Jordan and others. And do you think Bahrain's next?
I agree. First of all, I want to sign on to KT's analysis. I think that's exactly right. And just elaborate. You know, there have been critics of this, of the normalization. People have actually denounced this breakthrough, saying that it abandons the Palestinians. I don't think that's right. I don't think it's actually right at all. After 20 years of efforts to follow through on Oslo, efforts by the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and the Obama administration, it seems to me it was becoming more and more evident that the search for a comprehensive peace agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians was actually serving neither the Palestinians nor the Israelis. One can point to many reasons for that, not least internal political constraints that both sides faced. It was, nevertheless, the conventional wisdom remained that the path for Israel to normalization of relations with other Arab countries would be through peace with the Palestinians. This breakthrough suggests that the opposite might be true. That is, improving the, or reducing, I should say, the conflict between the Israeli Palestinians actually runs through other Arab capitals. What do I mean? Well, Kitty was envisaging the real possibility of greatly enhanced commerce and trade in the Middle East. Israel, you can imagine Israelis traveling to Dubai, Emiratis traveling to Tel Aviv. What one can also imagine is economic development coming to what the Palestinians call the West Bank, what many Israelis call Judea and Samaria. One can imagine such economic development, construction projects, business projects, which, while they may not in the near term create an independent Palestinian state, nevertheless lay the framework for increased Palestinian prosperity, increased Palestinian freedom, while at the same time preserving Israeli security. From my point of view, those are the two criteria of all reforms in the area of easing, reducing this conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Improve the quality of life of the Palestinians, but do nothing to undercut the security of Israelis. And it's actually not at all hard to imagine how normalization of relations with the Emirates and perhaps other countries could contribute to a new approach to this conflict, which again does not seek in one fell swoop to resolve it, but manages to reduce it. Of course, reduce it in the spirit of the White House peace plan that's now out there and on the table.
Thank you. And because you mentioned it, I want to follow up with you on this. Is the creation of a Palestinian state part of the goal here? Or is the goal the other parts of this that you mentioned in terms of greater economic benefit, creation of infrastructure, enhanced stability? Should we still consider a two-state solution to be the end result or end goal on the horizon?
Well, I'm not sure I would call it the end goal, because um, we have still larger goals. But the White House peace plan offers a realistic route to the creation of an independent Palestinian state. That remains the policy of the administration, and it's certainly the administration's hope that the normalization of relations between Israel and the Emirates and any other countries that might join, it's certainly the hope that that actually contributes to the realization of the White House peace plan. And again, picking up on what KT said, there's every reason to believe that that's correct, because as you'll recall, the White House peace plan had two large components. One was a political component with a detailed, realistic description of what an independent Palestinian state looks like. And the second part was a $50 billion plus plan for the reconstruction of not only the West Bank, but also of parts of Jordan and other areas in the Middle East. So it seems to me normalization of relations with the United Arab Emirates and all the commercial benefits that brings actually facilitates a very significant part of the White House peace plan. That is the economic, the political, and we should say cultural, educational development. It comes with a $50 billion price tag, and the White House always envisaged that our partners in the region contributing to the reconstruction of the West Bank.
Thank you. It's something that AJC is watching very closely and with great hope and optimism. Excuse my cliche, I want to pivot to China. KT, you said one of the reasons that you supported President Trump early on was because he understood the urgency of addressing Asia, and specifically addressing China. As the pandemic has led to increased instability, resurgent terror, the racking of economies, failed states, and more, are you concerned that the pandemic could actually tip the balance of power even further towards China?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, when President Trump came in, he was made fun of for being so focused on China. And he made it really clear. The Middle East wars, we have lost, we have fought and spent trillions in dollars and hundreds and thousands of Americans' blood and treasure in the Middle East and propping up leaders who didn't like us in places that didn't really matter in the end. And once we were energy independent, we didn't need to be in the middle of those wars. What we needed to do was put our eye back where it should have been for 20 years, which is on the rise of China and China's mercantilist practices, where they were literally taking jobs from the United States and putting them in China. Let's go back again to figure out why were we in this mess with China. Well, after World War II, the United States, as I said, we subsidized the security of a lot of our allies. We underwrote the economies of a lot of these countries with the idea that eventually they would become stable, trading partners, economically successful, and we would live in peace and prosperity. And that worked just fine with Germany, with all the countries in Europe, with Japan, with Korea. We assumed the same thing would happen with China. So in 2000, we welcomed China into the World Trade Organization. We agreed to economic terms, trade and investment terms to our disadvantage. But because we thought, well, China, once it modernizes its economy, it will become an open society, it will become an open economy, just like Japan has, Korea has, all the others. And we thought that'd be great way for peace and prosperity for the time ahead. The Chinese didn't do that. Instead of opening their society and opening their economy, they did just the opposite. They became a more authoritarian state. They closed down their economy to foreign investment. They stole intellectual property. And so they did all the things they weren't supposed to do. Nobody understood that. Nobody recognized that until Trump came along and he called it what it was. And so that's why the beginning of his administration had the trade wars. That was all negotiating leverage to try to find a way to work with the Chinese so that we could both thrive. Not at our expense, not at their expense, but that we would both have a reciprocal trading relationship, reciprocal investment relationship, and that we would then move on. And that was the phase one of the China-US trade deal. It didn't work out that way. The pandemic changed everything. It changed the way we thought of China, the way the Chinese and other countries have thought of China. And here's what happened. Once the Chinese realized that they had a problem in Wuhan, whether the virus came from a wet lab or whether it came from a laboratory, didn't matter. It's what the Chinese government did after that, and they employed it as a biological weapon. They shut down travel within China. You couldn't travel from Wuhan, the heart of the pandemic, to other parts of China. But the Chinese government was busy through the World Health Organization and their own diplomacy. They were saying, there's no problem here. This is not a big deal. The coronavirus, nothing here to worry about. And they continued to have trade between Wuhan and Europe, Wuhan and the United States, Wuhan and other parts of Asia. And they spread the pandemic throughout the globe. And while they were waiting to tell the world the problem that we really had, they then used that period of time, that month or so, to scoop up and corner the market on all the medications and the testing equipment and the personal protective equipment so that they then controlled that. And then they went to the Europeans and to us, and they blackmailed people. So they went to the European governments and said, you dare criticize us, you're not going to get the masks, you're not going to get the tests. They came to the president and they said to the United States government, you criticize us and you're not going to get acetaminophen, you're not going to get amoxicillin, you're not going to get penicillin, we're going to shut that down. They went to the Australians and they said, do you dare criticize us? We're going to shut down the trade of barley exports and beef exports to China. So they used what they call wolf warrior diplomacy to strong arm everybody. Now, in addition to that, now that the world's on lockdown and our economies we're all in recession, the Chinese are using this period to go around at fire sale prices and buy off resource companies in Africa, technology companies in Europe, technology companies in the United States. So the pandemic changed everything. And what you've seen in the last couple of months, and what you will see in President Trump's remarks tonight, is we are now going to have a different plan on how to deal with Asia. First thing we're going to do is bring the supply chains home. And that means whether it's manufacture of medication or whether it's manufacture of critical elements of national security, weapon system, et cetera, we're bringing that stuff home, or it's going to be made with our allies. Number two, go to our allies. And this is where US global leadership comes back. Go to our allies in Europe and Asia and say, look, we have all been exploited by China. Let us stand together. We free market democracies. Let us stand together and tell and insist from the Chinese, look, we want a reciprocal trade and playing field here. We don't want to stop you, but we want it to be fair across the board. And if the Chinese refuse, which they have so far done, then fine. We have the ability to decouple our economy in the essential elements, whether it's particularly in high technology, we will decouple. The third thing is, though, the US needs to regain the commanding heights of technology. We have not invested as we should have in high technology in the last 10 or 15 years. So we are reinvesting in whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's 5G networks. That's where the direction America's going to spend a lot of money in the next couple of years recovering from this. So the idea is you put it in areas which will create new jobs, particularly in the technology. So yeah, you bet. I mean, this is a very different US-Chinese relationship going forward. And whether it is a Cold War, that's really up to the Chinese. We're going to protect our interests. It's America first, just like it's always been China first for them. And if they want to deal with us as reciprocal, fair trading partners, terrific. But if they don't, we have options.
Peter, I want to stay with you on China, but pivot a little, if you don't mind, to an issue that I think doesn't get enough attention. And that's the question of the Uyghurs, the Uyghur religious minority. The Trump administration is credited, rightly so, for being one of the very few that's willing to speak out against the atrocities against the Uyghurs, levying economic and visa sanctions on those that are implicated in the persecution, the incarceration, and massive human rights violation of more than 1 million people. How can we influence other nations to get on board with this, to do something, to say something, to address this crisis?
It's a great question. If I could just, though, back up for one moment to say, I have one just small quibble with Katie, but I think she may agree with it. That is, I wouldn't go so far as to say that the global pandemic changed everything, because as Katie herself pointed out, it wasn't yesterday that China triggered this new era of great power competition.
True.
It's really 20 years or really 40 years in the making. What's happened with COVID-19 is that it has brought into focus for us, as we've seen in the dramatic detail that KT sketched, we've come to a much greater, much more precise understanding of the scope, the complexity, the urgency of what Secretary Pompeo has called the global challenge. So that's just a very small quibble. As far as the Uyghurs go, you know, you're right. The Trump administration and Secretary Pompeo within the administration deserve a great deal of credit, I believe, for calling the world's attention to what is almost certainly the greatest systematic abuse of human rights in the world today. More than 1 million plus Uyghurs in so-called re-education camps that involve purging them of their religious beliefs, forced sterilization, involuntary birth control, and a range of other brutal means to attempt to turn these people into good communists. So it is an outrage, should be an outrage against the conscience of mankind. And what can we do? We can ceaselessly speak about this outrage to our partners on the world stage. I believe, again, the Secretary has done an excellent job of that. Remember, Secretary Pompeo did something that I can't recall another Secretary of State doing. In late October, he gave a speech called the China Challenge, I think at the Hudson Institute in New York. And in that speech, he announced that he would be giving a series of speeches elaborating the various aspects of the China Challenge, China's systematic abuses of human rights being one aspect. So you're right, we've imposed a variety of sanctions. The speeches are, I think themselves, a concerted act of diplomacy by which the Secretary of State, the Trump administration, brings to the awareness of the American people, and we certainly hope the world, our friends and partners around the world, just what's going on. That is to say, what is the distinctive character of this regime? Well, how do we know the distinctive character of this regime? In part, we know its distinctive character by what the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, has been saying about it for the last decade, and what his four predecessors have been saying about the CCP since its creation in 1949. One, a firm rejection of so-called Western ideas about freedom, dignity of the individual, equality, rule of the law, and so on. And second, and this is very important, not only a desire for preeminence as a great power, but an ambition to reconfigure the international order in line with the Chinese Communist Party's understanding of China's rightful preeminence. That means repudiation of an international order, which the United States has done so much to create. It's ultimately grounded in a devotion to free and sovereign nation states, respect for human rights and respect for the rule of law, to be replaced by, this is their language, not mine, a socialist world order with China in the center, with different norms, not norms of human rights, rule of law, freedom, sovereign nation states. So are grappling with the terrible consequences of the global pandemic, our efforts to call to the world's attention the atrocities being perpetrated against the Uyghurs. These are both part and parcel of what we call the China Challenge. And to go back to the question, what can be done? Well, in addition to, addition to the sanctions, addition to I think Katie said, building up our what should be our advantage in science and technology is the continued process of educating the United States and friends and partners around the world about the gravity, the complexity, the urgency of the China challenge.
So helpful, thank you. We've been talking a lot about sort of the worldview and the changing world order. KT, your book, Revolution, Trump, Washington, and We the People, has several chapters about the president's worldview with in-depth explanations of America first and Make America Great Again and Peace Through Strength and what all of these things mean. Can you very briefly, sort of in a Twitter type phrase, tell us what this worldview is?
Okay, well, first, Make America Great Again, MAGA. That means to make the American economy needed to be fixed first before he could do anything else. And he understood that the same way Ronald Reagan understood that in the 1980s. You fix the American economy. And that's what the first 2 years of the Trump administration were devoted to. And that's what the second term of the Trump administration will be devoted to too, is to rebuild the American economy. But peace through strength. I mean, those, it sounds like a throwaway. You know, who doesn't want peace? Who doesn't believe in being strong? But peace through strength was originally Ronald Reagan's phrase, and Trump took it on, and it means a couple of things. It doesn't mean peace through capitulation. It doesn't mean peace through conquering others. And strength doesn't mean just military strength. It means economic strength, technological strength, moral strength. It means the strength of your democratic system and your society. So peace through strength is, we want to build the toughest military in the world, the strongest military in the world, and then we don't want to use it. We build it in order not to use it. It's counterintuitive, but we build it so that other countries, thinking that they might exploit us, take advantage of us, like the Chinese maybe want to do something in the South China Sea to challenge us, that they don't. They realize, well, you know, we shouldn't do it because if we do, America has a stronger military than we do, we won't win that fight. And then if they're dumb enough to challenge us militarily, then we can defend ourselves. So it's that kind of deterrence in a very real sense of, we build it not to use it. We build it so we don't have to use it. So that's peace through strength. And then the final part of it, though, when President Trump talks about America first, you know, it's not the global world order first. United States foreign policy really kind of lost track of itself probably 20 or so years ago at the fall of the Iron Curtain and the end of the Cold War. We stopped putting American interests first, and we started thinking of the world was all going to be just like us. They were going to be free market democracies, and everybody would follow the American order. And that's not what's happened. I mean, as Peter just pointed out, that's not the Chinese vision at all. They want to have China being the kingdom, middle kingdom, like it was for 1,500 years in the good old days, and the rest of the countries of the world be Chinese vassals, and all really give up their independent foreign policy and economic policy to do China's bidding, or they'll be blackmailed. So it was the argument that if you build American economy strong enough, if you build American technology strong enough, if you counter the China challenge, whether it's in creating the internet of the future, whether it's building the maritime trade route through the South China Sea, or whether it's building the land-based trade route that links Europe and Asia with the Belt Road policy, all of those things together mean that we need a plan too, and a plan that puts American interests first. And it was the idea that for too long, with regard to China especially, we put China first. We didn't put America first. We put China first. China was putting China first. We were putting China first. What did that do to America? It really put us in a very difficult position. And that's why it's the fierce urgency of now. When Peter said, the Chinese have made no secret of their ambition to really rewrite the rules of order once they get to be the dominant power in the world, the pandemic has speeded that up. They plan to be there in 5 years, not in 50 years. And so America first means to use all of the advantages that we have, our entrepreneurial people, our innovation, our ability to have allies who are like-minded allies instead of vassals. It's all of those things together to stand up to represent American interests. And as Trump himself said, when other countries, when we were, whether it was Iran or whether it was China or whether it was the Europeans, when we were underwriting their security when they're subsidizing their economies. He said, look, I don't blame you. You got a good deal. We wouldn't want it to give up. It was our fault that the American leaders they forgot who they worked for, which is the American people.
So I don't think you quite hit the Twitter character limit, but that was.
I know. I'm
No, but that was really, I think, very. No, it was very helpful and really encapsulated for all of our viewers sort of what the worldview is. Very, very instructional. We've had such a rich conversation. I want to leave time for audience questions. We haven't quite made it around the world. I'm going to trust that someone in the audience is going to ask a question about Russia. So before we turn to the audience, Peter, I want to ask you a question about Turkey. Turkey's been a special challenge for the United States, for the Europeans, for our NATO allies, not least because Turkey is a member of NATO and because we have 5,000 American airmen at Incirlik. For all that President Trump has done to sort of shake up foreign policy, now that Erdogan is continuing to provoke from incursions into Greek waters and airspace and buying Russian missiles, is a shakeup coming, and what might it look like? What could we expect?
On this question, I'm going to have to tread very, very delicately. Turkey's a complex question. All I will say is that here we are wrestling with it. We are staying on top of the issue. We recognize the importance to us of Turkey. But we also recognize the ways, and we recognize Turkey's various interests in throughout the Middle East. But I prefer not to discuss any of the specific issues that are raised by Turkey in the Middle East.
Spoken like a true diplomat. Jillian, I'll turn to you for audience questions now.
Thank you, Julie. The first question comes from Samantha Fox in Atlanta, and this question is for both panelists. What can we do, and what is the U.S. doing to convince other nations and multinational organizations like the EU about the threat that Hezbollah poses and the urgent need to designate them as a terrorist organization? Katie, if we could start with you.
Actually, can I just throw this one to Peter, because designating Hezbollah, in fact, is a State Department kind of legal thing. So he'd probably be in a better position to answer that.
So I'm sorry, could you just, I heard the Hezbollah part, but could you repeat the full question?
Sure, of course. What can we do, and what is the U.S. doing to convince other nations and multinational organizations like the EU about the threat of Hezbollah and the urgent need to designate them as a terrorist organization?
The short answer is that we are doing everything within our power. Right now, as you know, Lebanon is in a state of crisis. It was already in a state of crisis as a result of Hezbollah having effectively taken over the state. Its finances were in an impossible situation even before the devastating explosion in the Beirut harbor. The United States itself perfectly well understands that Hezbollah is a wholly owned subsidiary of Iran, that there is no future for Lebanon unless it's except a future in which the Lebanese people break free of the grasp of Hezbollah. So again, the short answer is that we do everything in our powers to convince our friend and allies to take the toughest possible stance against Hezbollah, which, by the way, as I'm sure the questioner knows, Hezbollah has in the neighborhood of 100,000 to 150,000 projectiles, rockets, including several thousand intermediate range missiles that can reach all sites in Israel. Hezbollah is a profoundly destabilizing force within the Middle East, and indeed it's part of Iran's larger effort to assert hegemony throughout the Middle East, going north from Tehran through Iraq and Syria and Lebanon to the Mediterranean, and going south through Yemen and the Gaza Strip up again to the Mediterranean. So our our policies have been clear. We will continue to attempt to persuade, we will continue to persuade others to understand the seriousness of the threat that Hezbollah presents.
Peter, you should know, if you don't, that the designation of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization has been a priority of AJC's for quite some time. And so you talk about using every effort at your disposal. We're with you. We are your partners. And please do not hesitate to call on us if ever we can play an advocacy role.
I will take advantage of that kind offer. Thank you.
Thank you. And there is a question here on Russia. This question comes from Rose Schwartz in Houston and is for KT. Rose says, there's a chapter in your book called Make Russia Great Again, and in it you discuss Putin's ambitions to rebuild Russia. Could you give us the Spark Notes version? What do you think the administration is doing right regarding Russia at this time, and what are we doing wrong?
What we're doing right is that President Trump has put really serious sanctions on the Russians. He's done it in a couple of ways to really put Russia in a very difficult position. Economically, because of the energy revolution in the United States, for the same reason that we've sort of bankrupted Iran, because they don't have any oil. I mean, oil exports, A, we've sanctioned, and B, even if they were to get them to market, they're at a low price. So Russia can't afford to meet payroll. They need oil prices to be north of $80 or $90 a barrel in order to pay for everything else that Russia does. So that's one thing that's really economically challenged Russia. The second thing that Trump's done is rebuild the American military. You know, it atrophied. We were fighting 2 wars in the Middle East, but it meant that we were denying resources to the rest of the military, and we were not upgrading and modernizing our military. Trump has done that. The next thing is that, particularly with Ukraine, the previous administration made a lot of noise about Russia and Ukraine, but they didn't do anything. They gave them blankets and meals ready to eat, but they didn't give the Ukrainian military what it really needed, which was just weapon systems. And so I think that's another way that they challenged Russia. Now, what has the administration done wrong? You know, I think, to me, I would like to see President Trump come out and be more critical, openly critical of some of Putin's actions. I understand why in the very beginning he didn't want to, because he thought maybe there was a possibility of having some kind of a relationship with Russia. I mean, he campaigned on it in 2016. I think he went into the administration in 2017 with the idea of, is there a way to work with Russia? You know, understanding that Russia interfered with the elections, Russia is a bad actor on the world stage, but is there some way to perhaps, in areas that we might have common interests, particularly in the Middle East around terrorism, work with them? What he really wanted to avoid was for Russia and China to get in bed with each other, because with Russian weapon systems and Chinese money, that's a very formidable foe to the United States. So where are you going forward? I don't think that the Russians, there's no peace agreement there, particularly because of the American domestic political situation. And I think there's just no peace agreement there. But Putin is a smart guy and he's a survivor. Economically, he's in trouble. So if we could ever in a second term make the case to Putin, you got a choice. You can go with China, which is eventually just going to rob your resources and wring you out to dry, or you can go with the United States on our terms, and maybe we have some kind of a relationship going forward. But that's for a second term.
Thank you. The next question here is from Emily Young from Philadelphia and is for Peter. She asks, under a continued Trump administration, do you see the possibility of any more formalized foreign policy strategies in regard to regions that don't make it into the spotlight as much, such as Latin America or Africa?
Yes, I certainly do. Now, here in the State Department, under the direction of the Secretary, we do think now always in terms of the great power competition that China has launched. But we need to understand that that competition is worldwide. China has made significant inroads in Africa. China has made significant inroads in South America. So even if we were only concentrating on more fully meeting the China challenge, it's quest for industrial dominance, it's stealing of intellectual property, it's its debt trap diplomacy by which it builds these great infrastructure projects in countries, including Africa and South America, and puts countries in untenable financial situations. Its trade, which is primarily extractive, taking resources out of these countries. Even if we were only to focus on one matter, the China challenge, we already are of necessity attending to the concerns of friends and partners in Africa, in South America. You can expect, I believe, even more of that.
Thank you. The next question is for Katie McFarland from Joanna Silver in Detroit. She says, though President Trump withdrew from the TPP in 2017, the remaining members of the trade pact have forged ahead with a new version, leaving the US role in the Asia Pacific in question and leaving a possible vacuum that would be filled by China. Do you see any return to such a partnership during Trump's second term?
Absolutely. And again, a lot of that is because of the pandemic and what Peter was just referring to, which is this debt trap where the Chinese, particularly in Asia, they lend money to a country to say, build a port or build a road. And then the country builds the road, but then can't make the debt payments. And so China says, okay, we're going to see this as collateral. I think that what you've seen is, particularly because of the South China Sea, where the Chinese have taken these islands that belong to other countries or their ownership is questioned, and the Chinese have built on them, making them into military bases and ports, having broken every promise they've ever made to not militarize them, and now to claim that the South China Sea, oops, it's an internal Chinese lake and we'll decide who sails in it. What it's done is the countries in Asia, particularly the ones that were in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, are now taking a really hard second look at China. Because of the pandemic, because of potential decoupling of our economy with the Chinese, I think that you'll see a big return, whether it's in the actual mechanism of the Trans-Pacific Partnership or some new mechanism. But yes, there will be a real effort to go to Japan. There already is. Japan, Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, the countries of Southeast Asia, India, to find a way to create the kind of economic, diplomatic trade bloc that was originally envisioned, but this time it would be one that would be really probably in better terms for the United States. Look, the reason Trump didn't like it in the first place was he said, we didn't get a very good deal out of it. Not that we don't want a Trans-Pacific Partnership, we want one that just is better for America. And so I think that will be possible in a second term. I think it'll be a big priority.
Thank you, Katie. The next question here is for Peter from Benjamin Weinman in Washington, D.C. He says, you're a member of the State Department's Commission on Unalienable Rights. Some might say that the most recent report suggests that the U.S. should defer to other countries' religious and cultural traditions when deciding whether to consider a human rights claim being made by its citizens as legitimate. How do you respond to arguments that the Commission's approach opens the door for the U.S. or any other country to take a pick and choose approach to universal human rights?
I would say that that's based on a misreading of the Commission's report. As you know, last year the Secretary of State Pompeo created the Commission on Unalienable Rights, and he gave the Commission two tasks, really one and the same task. That I want you to ground America's undoubted commitment to human rights, the rights inherent in all persons, in America's founding documents, Declaration of Independence and Constitution. And I want you to look at the obligations the United States took on when it led the struggle to pass, the triumphant struggle to pass the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. So the United States of America is created in dedication to certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Unalienable right is the 18th century language for a right that inheres in all persons. Now, it's true that the Commission, in examining the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, points out that there is that declaration, which we approved in '48, that declaration both identifies rights that serve as standards for all nations, while recognizing a certain latitude in how countries are going to interpret these rights. Let me give you an example, but not in religion, to illustrate the point. European countries, our friends in Europe, in the UK and in Europe, are committed to freedom of speech. The United States is committed to freedom of speech. European countries tend to take a tougher line on hate speech. The United States, the First Amendment actually protects hate speech. There's no First Amendment exception for hateful speech. Not to deny that some speech is hateful, but it remains protected by the First Amendment. That's an example of latitude in interpreting what freedom of speech means. But there's a world of difference between a debate over where to draw the line in protecting free speech and the repudiation of free speech, as, for example, in the People's Republic of China, with its Great Firewall, its systematic censorship, indoctrination, and surveillance. So yes, of course, the Commission report on unalienable rights recognizes that there is play in the joints in interpreting the meaning of religious liberty or interpreting the meaning of freedom of speech. But we must always distinguish between a certain play in the joints in interpreting an undoubted standard and a repudiation of that standard.
Thank you, Peter. And we have time for one final question, and apologies to our viewers whose questions we didn't get to. This question comes from Joseph Eisen in Westchester and is more of a forward-looking way to end this discussion. What do you both anticipate as President Trump's foreign policy priorities for the next 4 years if he's reelected? Katie, if we could start with you this time.
Yeah, I think it'll be continuing to stand up to China, to try to find a way of having a reciprocal relationship with them. But if that's not possible, if they don't want that to be possible, then it will be decoupling economically with China, maybe bringing the supply chain home, working with our allies in Europe and Asia to stand up together against China, and then finally to regain the commanding heights of technology. That would be one. And then the next will be to let in the Middle East, particularly, to let the Abraham Accords, now that the seed has been planted, to let it thrive and let it continue in the Middle East. I think that there will be a much greater focus in the Western Hemisphere, that the United States will look particularly to our Central and South American allies to create more of an economic unit, Canada, the United States, and Latin and Central America, an economic trading unit, potentially even an economic energy unit, and to let the world know we're not in retreat. You know, this is not the end of American greatness. This is the recreation of American greatness. So economic and global leadership, but on our terms.
Thank you. And Peter?
I will add only a small supplement to what Katie has just said, and it has to do with America first. Of course, America first is, in a sense, a commonsensical notion. The first responsibility of every nation state is to secure the safety, the freedom, and the prosperity of that particular nation. So I understand this as a kind of return to common sense. But of course, as has been often pointed out, but needs to be emphasized all the time, America first does not mean America alone. The only way, I shouldn't put it that way, but in order for America to effectively protect freedom at home, to have the world's most productive and innovative and scientifically advanced economy, the only way for the United States to ensure a free and open international order, which is crucial to international trade, the only way to do this is with allies, friends, and partners. What we need to do is make sure that our system of alliances and the international organizations through which we operate, what we need to do is make sure that they are serving our interests, especially our interests in freedom and prosperity at home and in a free and prosperous international order that that respects the freedom and national sovereignty of the countries of the world.
Thank you so much for that, Peter, and to you as well, KT. As promised, we covered, I think, the course of the globe in this conversation. It was a rich dialogue, and I think very helpful for, I'll speak personally, but I think also for our viewers to understand sort of both the inner workings of, Peter, what you're working on in the State Department every day, and KT, what you have such insight into in terms of the Trump administration and the president himself and the worldview that guides the policies. So I thank both of you so
Can I
much.
just interrupt you, Julie, and say how much I appreciate what the American Jewish, what you guys do, because so much foreign policy issues ends up being acrimonious and people screaming at each other, and every issue is opposed by every other side. And so the fact that you conduct civil debates, you bring in both sides, you're even-handed. I just think you're one of the few organizations in the United States that does that and still does that. And I really applaud the effort that you make and the work that you do. So thank you for inviting me and Peter, and thank you for your wonderful questions, and keep it up. America needs you.
Yes, what KT says, yes.
You're both wonderful. We'll invite you back all the time.
Oh yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all for this
Thank you.
discussion and for spending time with AJC on these issues.
Thank
I'd
you.
also like to thank our audience for joining us today. If you have enjoyed our programming over the past 2 weeks, please consider making a donation to AJC at ajc.org/donate. Thank you all again, and goodbye.